Good day. Today is Tuesday, 23rd September 2025, and yesterday I was discussing in my program President Putin of Russia's proposal that there should be a one-year extension of the New START treaty, which is due to expire in February 2026, in order to provide time for further discussions, negotiations between Russia and the United States, perhaps to build on that treaty, or perhaps to extend it further, or at any rate to take some step in order to preserve arms limitation, strategic arms limitation, to avoid a nuclear arms race, to try to preserve the entire system of arms control, and through that course to strengthen the already tattered system of nuclear non-proliferation, and hopefully to make the whole prospect of nuclear war and World War III less likely. As you can gather from that introduction, I consider this a very important issue indeed. Well, I was waiting to see what the response would be in the United States, in Europe, amongst European governments, amongst the American political class, and the answer is almost total silence. I find it quite extraordinary that this should be the case. As somebody who lived through the Cold War, who remembers how much time and energy and effort was devoted to building up the system of strategic arms control from the 1960s through the 1970s into the 1980s, the important role that played in creating confidence and trust and securing détente between the superpowers of that period. It bewilders me how completely uninterested the political class in the West is about this topic today. So I find articles appearing in the media today, for example, about mysterious drones flying over Danish airports, which are, of course, automatically and immediately alleged to have a Russian provenance. There's no evidence of this, at least not as of the time of making of this program. There are articles, again, about Donald Trump and his various intentions, and lots of criticisms of him today in the media. One, for example, an article in the Financial Times by Edward Luce, again stands out for me, talks about the United States exiting itself, though it doesn't really, in my opinion, provide any valid reasons to think this. But anyway, there is absolutely nothing about avoiding World War III, preventing an arms race, securing nuclear arms limitation, or any of these things. Nor is there any comment or statement about it from the President of the United States. And instead, what I suspect is going to happen is that we're just going to drift along until February, and then at that point the START treaty will indeed expire. To the extent that this event is even noticed in the West, I predict that the Russians will be blamed. And, of course, hardly anybody is going to mention the fact that the President of Russia yesterday made what, to all intents and purposes, is a serious proposal to have the treaty extended for 1 year to allow time for further negotiations. Well, if we do slip into the ultimate crisis, which, as a father of 3 young children and somebody who values peace and wants to see the survival of humanity, I earnestly hope is not the case, then the staggering complacency, the myopia of our political class, the incredible belligerence with which it brings to every issue, well, that will stand condemned. Though, heavens knows, in the kind of crisis we are likely to see, condemnation will be short-lived because there will be few people left afterwards, presumably, to take it further. Anyway, there it is. I felt I had to say this. I'm going to turn to other topics, but my feelings about the complete non-response in the West to this entirely sensible and necessary proposal leaves me with a very heavy heart and a very ominous sense about where exactly it is that we're going. I ought to say that Peskov, Putin's spokesman, was asked about whether the Americans and the Russians have discussed this matter, and he did say that the Russians did bring it up with Trump during the Anchorage summit back in August, and there was a discussion about the START treaty then, but I don't get the sense that the president himself is really very interested in this subject, and I don't get the sense that anybody else of importance in the West is interested in it either. They all remain obsessed by the single overriding topic that continues to obsess them, which is finding some means, some possible means, to defeat Russia in Ukraine. This remains their single overriding obsession, at least of the European political class, whilst in the United States, the president and his officials are mostly focused now on domestic matters. Now, speaking of attitudes in the United States, I read a most interesting article, again in the Financial Times, by Gideon Rachman, who made what I thought was a very interesting point. He's recently visited the Baltic states. He's been to Estonia and to Lithuania. He's had a conversation with the Lithuanian Foreign Minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, and he disclosed something that I found most interesting, which is that apparently within the Trump administration and on the part of some of the civilian officials in the Pentagon, there is growing anger and exasperation at what they see as the extreme belligerence towards Russia of the Baltic states and of their extraordinary influence over European diplomacy. And apparently there was quite straightforward statements from the Americans to the Baltic leaders that the United States, the current administration, simply doesn't trust them. And Gideon Rachman said the same, that the Baltic states feel the same now about the current administration in the United States. There is increasing antipathy and antagonism, and it is increasingly building because, quite obviously, following on from what I was saying in my program yesterday, the Americans believe that the Baltic states and the other European states are continuing to want to drag them in to a confrontation with Russia, a military confrontation with Russia that the United States simply does not want. And one of the most interesting comments that Gideon Rachman made is that the Americans apparently have developed concern about what they call the Estonianization of European foreign policy, the extent to which all of the leading European powers, Germany, France under Emmanuel Macron, Britain under Keir Starmer, others, have adopted the Baltic states' view of Russia and frame their entire policy towards Russia around that view. Now, I find that very interesting because I happen to know that within Russia, some of the people there who are interested in foreign policy and who wield influence. And I suspect some of the people, perhaps within the Russian government itself and the foreign ministry and the general staff, though to be absolutely clear, let me make it clear again, these people do not talk to me. But anyway, I have heard that they have recently, since Friedrich Merz became Chancellor of Germany, taken to calling Germany Greater Estonia. So it seems that both superpowers involved in the affairs of Europe, the Americans and the Russians, agree now about one thing, that the extreme influence of the Baltic states over European foreign policy, and specifically perhaps over German foreign policy and the foreign policy of the EU, that is both dangerous and at some level ludicrous as well, given how small and economically inconsequential these countries, these Baltic countries, actually are. Well, there it is. Maybe next time they meet, the Americans and the Russians can have a chat about this and talk about it with each other. I think actually, and I'm being serious now, I think that would be a help to both of them, because it looks as if they each independently have come to a realization that with the Baltic states, they share a common problem. Anyway, there it is. So, increasing tensions between the Europeans and the Americans, increasing tensions between the Americans and the Baltic states, and of course, talking about Russia and the Baltic states. This is an absolute disaster, and it is one which, as far as I'm concerned, is entirely one of the Baltic states' own creation. To repeat a point I have made before, there is only one country that can guarantee the independence of the Baltic states, and that is Russia. The United States is situated a continent and an ocean away. It remains a very powerful country. It is a global superpower, but it has interests all over the world. It cannot be expected to shape its entire foreign policy around the obsessions and the security needs, as they imagine them to be, of the Baltic states. The Baltic states need to sort out their relations with the superpower next door, not depend, to the extent that they now do, on the superpower that is far away. And by the way, on that topic, there's been a good piece in Responsible Statecraft, the news site of the Quincy Institute, which talks about British foreign policy and specifically Britain's latest national security review, and it is by the excellent Anatol Lieven. And he points out, Lieven also points out the extraordinary muddle and mix of grandeur and fantasy with which this security review has been written. On the one hand, it continues to insist that Britain must remain a global power. Essentially, it assumes that Britain is a global power, that it has to maintain its presence in Ukraine and continue to double down on support for Ukraine. It will continue to support or insist upon a British player's presence in far-flung, uninhabited islands like the Sandwich Islands and places of that kind near the Antarctic. It refuses to countenance any kind of retreat from any British position anywhere in the world. And at the same time, of course, it understands that Britain absolutely does not have the power to do any of this by itself. It must rely always on the United States, and it is becoming increasingly concerned that the United States is no longer the predictable ally that it once was. And, well, the British response to this is to try to keep the Americans still committed to Britain by making America's enemies Britain's enemies. So Britain must now have bad relations with China, bad relations with Iran. It must treat these two countries as enemies. It must send the one or two ships from its much diminished navy that it can still send to the Asia-Pacific region to show the British flag there. There is an admission at some level that this is tokenism of the worst kind. The review talks about Britain's commitment to Australia and the AUKUS arrangement between Australia, the United States and Britain. But as Anatol Lieven points out, in the inconceivable event that China was ever going to take military action against Australia, China has no plan to take military action against Australia. Why would it be interested in attacking Australia, which, by the way, is located very, very far away from China? But in the inconceivable event that something like that could happen, Britain's power is now so diminished that there is absolutely nothing at all that Britain could do to help Australia in that kind of predicament. So why make an enemy of China? Why get into this situation where one is opposed to China and starts taking steps that the Chinese will inevitably come to see as hostile, when there is absolutely nothing that can be done to change the situation in the Asia Pacific, because the days when Britain could wield power in that region are long gone. On this topic, there is an article by a Guardian commentator, Natalie Tocci, who I believe is actually ultimately from Italy. She is the Guardian's Europe columnist. Anyway, she says that she has recently visited China and she's had meetings with important people in China. She doesn't say who they are, but I've no doubt that that is true. And, of course, as one would expect from someone who writes in The Guardian, surprise, surprise, she brought up the topic of Ukraine. And she criticised the China to their face, the Chinese to their face, for their continued support for Russia. She said that for the Europeans, this is now an extraordinarily important matter because the Europeans judge their security interests to be engaged, and that for that reason, if China really wants a better relationship with Europe, then China needs to change its policies towards Russia and to distance itself from Russia in all sorts of ways. Well, let me give it to Natalie Tocci here. She frankly states the Chinese response. The replies I got were telling. Just as Europeans now view their relationship with China through the lens of Russia, China sees Europe, and by Europe, of course, one must also include Britain, China sees Europe through the paradigm of its competition with the United States. Beijing believes that if worst comes to worst in US-China relations, Europe would stand with Washington, notwithstanding Trump and the US's abandonment and betrayal of Europe. For China, I was told, keeping Russia on side is a strategic must. In the current circumstances, Russia trumps Europe from Beijing's perspective. It's hard not to see the logic. Well, this is absolutely and obviously true. I think there is a lot more to the relationship between China and Russia than these comments. But the Chinese assessment is obviously correct. If there is a crisis between the United States and China, the Europeans will side with the United States. Britain, as Anatole Lieven has correctly pointed out, absolutely, definitely, certainly will. And in that kind of situation, the Chinese are absolutely not going to let go of the key ally that they have, who they can rely upon in that confrontation, which is, of course, Russia, because they don't trust the Europeans and don't believe that the Europeans will fail to side in a confrontation between the United States and China, won't fail to side with the United States. And obviously, this is correct. And then, of course, Natalie Tocci finishes her article by saying this: Russia represents a vital threat to European security, and Europeans will bend over backwards to keep the US engaged in their defense. This is likely to fail regardless of how much flattery and self-abasement they offer to Trump. And while Europe could potentially confront Russia without the United States, it cannot do so while China is in its crosshairs too. This leaves Europe with no easy way out, but wishing the problem away is no answer. And of course, she doesn't provide an answer. In fact, the answer is there. It's absolutely blindingly obvious what Europe needs to do in this kind of situation. It needs to establish peace in Europe by having discussions with the Russians. We see that the Americans are becoming exasperated with the Baltic states because of their intransigence and their extreme hard line. And by the way, the Gideon Rachman article also speaks of American frustration with Kaja Kallas, and who around the world now, outside Europe, is not frustrated by Kaja Kallas. And we see that the Chinese are frustrated and alienated as well, because they don't trust the Europeans anymore. They don't, and I say this, understand the European obsession with Ukraine and with Russia, and they realize that in any confrontation, the Europeans will automatically side with the Americans, however bad the relationship between the Europeans and the Americans appears to be, so that China will remain a solid partner of Russia. So, given that this is so, surely the question that Natalie Tocci's article poses answers itself. Go and talk to the Russians. Find out from the Russians what it is that they actually want in Europe. Actually, it's not difficult. Putin set it all out in his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024. He set out what he wants in Ukraine, and it's still there on the table, though who knows for how much longer. Why not also revisit some of the other things that the Russians have been talking about too? The topic of those two treaties that they proposed in December 2021, treaties that sought a stop to NATO's eastward extension, that tried to find some way to recalibrate the strategic and security architecture in Europe in order to address Russian security concerns. But of course, that is not what we are prepared to do. The Ukrainians and the British, for example, have just completed the ratification process of the defense treaty that Starmer and Zelensky signed off on in January. The treaty which committed Britain to defending Ukraine or supporting Ukraine indefinitely, and which disastrously speaks of Ukraine's irreversible path towards NATO. Unless this is acknowledged, that this approach is acknowledged, we're going to be caught forever in that trap which Anatol Lieven and Natalie Dodgy both identify. We cannot sort out our relations with a superpower on our doorstep, which is Russia. We have no hope of sorting out our relations with the other, even mightier superpower, much mightier superpower, which is now allied to Russia, which is China. And we're doing this even though we don't trust the third superpower, the United States, which used to be, as we thought, our ally, even as we tried to win it over by making its enemies our enemies, even though deep down we always worry that it is simply going to walk away. This is not rational statesmanship. This is not good diplomacy, to put it mildly. This is, again, the sacrifice of the interests of the people of Europe in pursuit of a set of obsessions. And obsessions, well, they only lead ultimately to one place, and that is to disaster. Anyway, there we go. That's what I want to say about the attitudes of the various governments in Europe. Let's now turn to more immediate worries, because, of course, there are lots of grounds now for worry, because the latest thing that we're now doing in Europe is that we are getting apparently sucked in deeper and deeper into the internal affairs of all places, the tiny former Soviet Republic of Moldova, the country that is in a race with Ukraine to become the poorest country of Europe, a country that is becoming increasingly unstable, where there is a deeply polarizing election fairly soon, and where there are worries in Europe that the party of the current president, current pro-European president, Maria Sandu, might fail or fall short in the forthcoming parliamentary elections, which are due to take place over the weekend. And every stop is being pulled in order to avoid that eventuality. Again, all the usual things that happened before in recent elections are once more at play. So the Moldovan authorities won't open polling stations in Russia in any way that is remotely proportional to the size of the Moldovan population in Russia. And apparently the Moldovan diaspora in Russia is enormous. But all over Europe, they're busy opening polling stations so that what is assumed to be the pro-Europe, pro-EU, pro-Sandu Moldovan electorate in Europe will be able to vote in this election as well. And there continue to be pressure placed on various opposition parties that you would never hear or know about this from any commentary in Europe. And, well, the Russians, for their part, are now starting to give warnings. The Russian intelligence agency, the SVR, is speaking about a real possibility of Western military occupation of Moldova. Of course, because the Russians say this, it might not necessarily be true, and it might be going too far to assume that this is actually the case. But anyway, one can see that the Russians are now becoming increasingly concerned and nervous. And of course, another person who's becoming increasingly concerned and nervous, and who is perhaps much more likely to decide to send troops into Moldova, President Zelensky of Ukraine, has now just signed a law or decree whereby he empowers himself to deploy Ukrainian troops on foreign territory. Now, it is universally assumed that this is some kind of legal preparation for a Ukrainian military intervention in Moldova, especially if the elections over the weekend, despite all of the manipulations and the pressure and all of that, go wrong. Now, all I will say about that is that it seems that the Ukrainians have form here. I remember reading some months ago in the American media that during the Biden period, Ukraine came very close to sending troops into Moldova. And Moldova, I should say, is a fractured polity. There are strong disagreements between the government and much of the population. Much of the population, probably a clear majority of the people who actually live in Moldova, would prefer to see Moldova distance itself from the Ukrainian conflict and seek an improvement of relations with Russia. It seems that within Moldova itself, the president, Maria Sandu, has become increasingly unpopular, and her unpopularity has been growing. If she survives as president, it is because of Western support and increasingly because of the votes of the Moldovan diaspora in Europe, the Moldovan diaspora in Russia being effectively prevented from voting. So Moldova is a already fractured society. And of course, within Moldova itself, there is a region, Transnistria, where there's a large Slav population. It is friendly with Russia. It has strong economic links there. And there is a small Russian military force located there in accordance with UN Security Council resolutions. It was sent there in the period shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is present there as a kind of peacekeeping force. So it seems that at an earlier point in the conflict in Ukraine, the Ukrainians actively considered plans to send troops into Moldova to support, presumably, the pro-Western government in Moldova, and specifically to break this enclave in Transnistria, to bring it to heel. And there have been various moments when Transnistria has also faced energy blockades, which have been organized by Moldova. Those have ceased for the time being. But Transnistria has been a consistent issue for the authorities in Kiev and, of course, in the Moldovan capital Chisinau and in Brussels and in the various European capitals. And quite plausibly, this decree of Zelensky's not only paves the way for a Ukrainian military intervention in Moldova, but is preparatory to that step. Now, it didn't happen before because the Americans, this is the time the Biden administration objected. They did not want steps to be taken that might expand the war beyond Ukraine itself. At that time, they appear to still have harbored hopes still that Ukraine would be able to win militarily its war against Russia. This was some years ago. And they didn't feel the need, therefore, to expand the war, and they thought it might be dangerous for that to happen. And they told the Ukrainians not to do it, and the Ukrainians, in the end, at the last moment, apparently, pulled back. I wonder whether the same restraints will apply this time. So it is quite possible that over the next few days, by this time next week, we could see Ukrainian forces enter Moldova, especially if there are complaints about the conduct of the elections, if there are protests against the outcome of the elections. Entirely possible, whoever wins, just to say. And it could very well be the case that with the Western powers, the Europeans, saying, as they're bound to do, that the protests have been engineered by the Russians, or if the opposition wins, that the victory of the opposition has been engineered by the Russians. Anyway, it is entirely possible that with the support of the European powers, the Ukrainians might enter Moldova and try to establish themselves there. And it is not impossible that other contingents from European states, Romania obviously being the key one, might enter Moldova as well. It is perhaps overlooked that one of the consequences of the immensely complicated and protracted electoral crisis in Moldova last year and earlier this year, the crisis where Kali Georgescu topped the poll in the first round of an election that was then cancelled and then was prevented from standing when the election was called again, and is, by the way, apparently facing more charges about which I'm not particularly well informed. But anyway, the one outcome of this very complicated election process is that it brought to power in Romania, a new president who is a fervid supporter of union between Romania and Moldova. In other words, who wants Romania, in effect, to annex Moldova. So it is not impossible that this president in Romania will try to take advantage of any political crisis in Moldova in order to achieve that objective. So we could be looking at a very big crisis over the next couple of weeks. The Russians will, of course, object, but their army is still some distance away. Eventually, they will reach this territory. They will reach the borders of Moldova itself, or they will arrange a peace agreement in Ukraine, which will probably expand Russian influence to this region too. We could be seeing more crisis in the future. It's far from obvious to me that the arrival of the Romanians would be welcomed by everybody in Moldova, including many people in Moldova who are Romanian speaking. But anyway, bear in mind that this crisis is just there over the horizon. Of course, the one thing the European Union, the European states, seem unable to do is to just let events in Moldova take their course. Let the elections there happen in a normal and orderly way, and accept the outcome of those elections. That is not something that the European Union any longer is structurally organized to do. And in that, of course, it shares the attitudes, or rather all major European governments share its attitudes as well. Anyway, that's the situation, and of course it does have an impact on the situation in Ukraine. Now, probably, I would quickly say, Zelensky can scratch together enough troops to send to Moldova, but inevitably that will require troops to be sent from the front lines in Ukraine. Every account of the fighting in Ukraine now is agreed that the military situation there is difficult and that the Ukrainians are overextended. But, well, playing political games in Chisinau is probably going to be a prospect, an opportunity that Zelensky cannot resist. It's more important to achieve that, perhaps, than to achieve any other kind of outcome in the battle for Ukraine itself. Now let's talk about the situation in Ukraine. Over the last 24 hours, both the Russians and the Ukrainians have launched drone and missile strikes against each other. The Russians recently complained about a Ukrainian drone strike on a resort near Yalta, the leading town in Crimea, the leading resort town in Crimea. And the Russians have, over the last 24 hours, responded by a very much more powerful strike, apparently in retaliation to that. Of course, again, you will not find any commentary about that Ukrainian strike on Yalta. Ukrainian attacks of this kind are never reported in the media in the West. I am not there. I cannot assess the damage. I'm not going to discuss the claims and counterclaims made about this attack. All I will say is that there does seem to have been damage done. There are photographs. It's difficult to believe that this damage can have happened without some kind of attack having taken place. But as I said, nobody in the West appears to be at all interested. But as for the battle, as for the fighting in Ukraine itself, well, there's been a certain amount of additional news now about the fighting in Pokrovsk specifically. And this came yesterday from Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which, as I have said already, is the most reliable single source on the course of the fighting in Pokrovsk. And Radovka is claiming that the Russians have now introduced more troops into the city of Pokrovsk itself, that they have intensified the pace of their advance in Pokrovsk, that the Ukrainians are positioned in certain high-rise buildings located mostly in the southeast of Pokrovsk, but that the Russians are indeed systematically cutting off the supply lines and are now in control of much of the further territory of Pokrovsk. And the implication of the article from Radovka is that this is a serious offensive that the Russians are conducting in Pokrovsk, and that the objective absolutely now is to capture the town, and that progress to achieve that objective is being made. I have no doubt that this is true. There is an extraordinary video which has appeared, which shows the situation in a field close to the village of Belitska, where there's been intense fighting. Belitska is located to the north of Rodinska on the main supply road between supply road to Pokrovsk from the north, a supply road which the Russians have already effectively closed. In fact, there are many reports that the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk is no longer receiving regular supplies and hasn't been doing so for some time now. Anyway, this is an extraordinary film because what it showed, and it was a video footage, I'm not sure who made the video, but it was video footage taken from a drone, and it showed the entire field crisscrossed with fiber optic cables. It showed the enormous extent, in other words, of Russian drone activity in this area to the northeast of Pokrovsk. It is important to stress that it is the Russians, far more than the Ukrainians, who have developed and pioneered and operate fiber optic drones. The Ukrainians have been able to make some, but they have never been able to deploy them in anything like the kind of quantities that the Russians can do. And, well, the picture, this film, showing this large field, I mean, it's a considerable area, so heavily covered with cables, fiber optic drone cables, that it just brings home the enormous amount of Russian drone activity that there is in this area. Clearly, the Russians are able, with their drones, to attack Ukrainian military formations. But undoubtedly, another thing that they do is that they attack the Ukrainians on the main supply roads. It's probably a nightmare for Ukrainian troops to move in this territory at all. There have been many complaints in the Ukrainian media already about this, that the Ukrainians are basically find movement close to the front lines now extremely dangerous. I mentioned how a couple of days ago, when Zelensky himself came to this area, he did not actually attempt to go to Pokrovsk itself. Clearly, it is too dangerous for him to try. So anyway, for me, this video footage in some ways set out the position of the battle more clearly than anything else that I have ever seen. Now, the Ukrainians continue to defend themselves in Pokrovsk. One wonders for how much longer. My sense is that the Russians in Pokrovsk, in Kupiansk, in Liman, in Siversk, in all of these towns where fighting is taking place, that their major objective continues to be to destroy the Ukrainian forces, even above, it's an even higher priority than capturing the towns themselves. And one can see how this is playing out. I was reading another report earlier today about a Ukrainian military unit, a newly raised Ukrainian military unit that has left Lvov, and apparently a significant number of the men who were enlisted in that unit have either deserted or are trying to do so. It's not clear to me where these troops are being sent, but they've been told that they are going to be sent to the front lines, and apparently many of them now consider this a death sentence, and one which serves no purpose anymore. because even they can see that Ukraine eventually is going to lose. So that's Pokrovsk. Everywhere else on the situation on the front lines remains equally bad. The Russians are now, by the way, bombing Zaporozhye. They are dropping fab bombs on the city of Zaporozhye, something they've never done before. I was reading again this morning that the Russians have bombed the giant Motorsic factory in Zaporozhye. This is the biggest factory in Zaporozhye. It is a factory that used to make gas turbines for the Soviet Union. Gas turbines, some of which equipped, by the way, the engines of the Soviet fleet. More pertinently, it also built aircraft engines, the D-18T aircraft engine for the Antonov 124 heavy lift aircraft, the AI-20 used by the Antonov 12, the the Soviet equivalent of the Hercules, the American Hercules transport aircraft. Anyway, the Russians have severely bombed Motorsic, and it looks as if, to say it frankly, Zaporozhye city is being softened up, to use a rather ugly military term, prior to what I suspect is going to be another assault. So the battle there continues, and the Russians continue to work on trying to stop the movement of men and supplies through Zaporozhye eastwards towards the front lines. And of course, the front lines are drawing closer to Zaporozhye city, both from the south and from the east, every day. I suspect that at some point in the next few weeks, we're going to hear an announcement from Ukraine that the civilian population of Zaporozhye city has been told to evacuate. So anyway, the war continues, and it continues in the same way as always. The Russian advance, a grinding advance, rapid in some places, slower in others, aggressive attrition still operating all the time. Ukrainian losses still continuing to mount. The Ukrainians still short of men, in fact more short of men than ever. The Ukrainian General Krivonos, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, has given a scathing response to a Ukrainian interviewer who claimed to him that the Ukrainians are successful in shooting down most of the Duran drones and most of the missiles that the Russians launch against them, and which now regularly bombard Kiev. The general, basically, who's retired, basically said to the interviewer, "What are you talking about? I live close to the Artyom factory. I know how much damage is actually being done and how weak our air defenses, in truth, really are." But anyway, the bombing, the advancing, the steady push westwards of the Russians continues, and the resistance of this line of cities continues to buckle. I would say that in the Konstantinovka area, this Konstantinovka is the big city to the east of Pokrovsk. It is the southernmost town in the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. It's located, by the way, some distance from the central and biggest town of this conurbation, which is Kramatorsk. Apparently, the road south from Kramatorsk to Konstantinovka is now also being pounded by the Russians, and Russian drones patrol it almost continuously. and the supply situation for the Ukrainian troops in Konstantinovka is also becoming increasingly difficult as the drones gradually suffocate the sending of supplies to Konstantinovka from Kramatorsk. Just saying. But anyway, it seems as if the Russians are also now working to launch a deeper offensive into the heart of this town of Konstantinovka. And of course, if Pokrovsk falls, as I've already discussed in many places, Konstantinovka itself becomes undefendable. And if Konstantinovka falls, and Pokrovsk falls, and Liman and Siversk falls, or perhaps to be more precise, when these places fall, and Kupiansk falls, and again, it's a question of when, not if, Kupiansk falls, then Slavyansk, Kramatorsk cannot be defended much longer, and when they fall, the Russians can advance to the Dnieper, and it is the effective end of the war. But anyway, I've discussed all this before. I'm not going to discuss it, repeat myself further in this program. But the Russians are now pushing hard into Konstantinovka too. So anyway, that is a quick overview of the battle. As I said a few programs ago, once I've fully familiarized myself with all of the information, and I have a lot to go through because obviously I've been away in the United States, I intend to devote more time in one of these programs to discussing and updating about the situation on the front lines. But anyway, the battle continues. I should quickly add that I have been told by a source with access to information in Russia that Putin's assertion that there are now 700,000 Russian troops operating on the territory of post-1991 Ukraine is a significant underestimate, that the total number of Russian troops is much greater. This source thought it might be as high as 1 million, but far from all of them have so far been committed to the battle. Probably following Russian strategic doctrine, the plan is to commit more of these troops to the battle once the great line, the defense line of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk has been broken. This is the classic Russian approach, deep battle, as it has been described, use infantry and artillery, and drones work as a kind of artillery to break through the fortifications, the fortified lines of the enemy's position, and then exploit the breakdown, the breakthrough, with rapidly moving armored forces. Probably that is what is coming, but anyway, we're not quite there yet. Now, there has been a further development, and it's one that has diplomatic as much as economic significance. It's become very obvious to me that over the last few weeks, China has basically made a decision that it's not going to worry about Western sanctions anymore. I suspect that the turning point was what happened in April, the economic war that briefly took place between the United States and China. At that time, the United States basically pulled back. It started to lower the tariffs that it had imposed on China. Trade between China and the United States resumed, and the cause of the American climb down was worries in the United States that the United States was running out of manufactured goods, including subcomponents needed for American industry, and even more pertinently, was running out of supplies of critically important rare earths. And the Chinese, I've heard, continue to exact tight control on rare earth exports, and they've also added controls on exports of germanium, apparently an important mineral, which is not, as I understand it, one of the rare earths, but one which is also in short supply and which is also needed for industry, especially military industry. So the Chinese now feel that they're in a position of advantage. This probably explains, by the way, the deal that the Chinese and the Americans have now completed on TikTok. TikTok was, as many no doubt remember, a successful social media platform created by China. It was very popular with young people, especially. The United States confiscated it, seized it, basically saying that it was a national security threat. There was much toing and froing between China and the United States about what to do about TikTok. It was a short time ago on the brink of closure, but now apparently a deal has been done, and apparently it has been bought at a significant price by an American consortium led by Oracle. I'm not going to devote time to this because I don't pretend to have all of the details, or to be, if I have to be honest, especially interested in this story. But the reason this has happened, it seems to me, is because the Chinese, seeing themselves in a position of advantage, now feel that they can give ground on something that is of secondary importance to them. But what the Chinese are simultaneously doing is that they're stepping up their economic contacts with the Russians. And we've seen more and more evidence of this over the last few weeks. Firstly, there was the decision to sign off on the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline project. This had been delayed for a long time, partly, I think, because of sanctions concerns. But now the Chinese and the Russians are moving forward with this project. Mongolia is now also on side. It's been pointed out to me that the building of this pipeline will also have domestic relevance for Russia's economy in the Far East as well, because it will enable the Russians to gasify their economy there as well. A lot of the natural gas that will pass through this pipeline will be distributed to Russian regional towns and centres, bringing down the cost of energy in these places and enabling, therefore, a further industrial expansion, which is already taking place there. But anyway, Power of Siberia 2 is moving forward. The Chinese and the Russians have now revived their joint aerospace programs, the wide-bodied aircraft. The Chinese now look to be prepared to buy Russian jet engines, and they are collaborating with the Russians on avionics for these aircraft. Perhaps even more interesting, the Russian Prime Minister, Mishustin, has just made a speech in which he's spoken about the enormous expansion of the Russian microelectronics industry over the last few years. He says that it's increased, I think it was by threefold over the last 4 years, with more and more Russian companies turning to Russian producers for electronic goods. He said that the plan is to maintain the momentum and to increase expansion of electronics, Russian-made electronics, even further. But what I thought was more interesting still was that he said, in fact, much further. But what was even more interesting is that he said that the Russians and the Chinese, and by the way, the Belarusians, are now increasingly working together in this field also. So they're working together in the field of electronics as well. And again, this was an area where perhaps the Chinese had held back somewhat because they probably were concerned about sanctions aftershocks. And China has lifted all visa restrictions on Russians who can now enter China without visas. The Russian Foreign Ministry says that there is a huge demand in Russia, amongst Russians, to travel to China now. And that suggests that more and more Chinese banks and financial institutions are prepared to process payments from Mir cards and other financial instruments, Russian financial instruments. And then perhaps most interesting of all and most pertinent to what has just happened, there are reports today in the Financial Times about a Chinese container ship which since the summer has been traveling through the Black Sea and which has stopped and apparently collected cargo in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Now, China, until recently, had given clear guidance to Chinese ships and Chinese ship-owning companies not to visit ports in which used to be pre-2014 part of Ukraine and which are still recognized internationally as Ukrainian, even though obviously it is the Russians who are in physical occupation. And it's likely that any ship owner or ship, Chinese ship owner or ship that goes there is going to face at least some kind of sanctions from the European Union and obviously from Ukraine too. But a Chinese ship has now visited Sevastopol, perhaps the most glaring piece of sanctions busting of all, and it has done so repeatedly since the summer and is apparently continuing to do so. And apparently there have been fierce protests about this from the Ukrainians. The Chinese have made no public response. The Chinese have told the Ukrainians that their guidance to their ship owners to keep clear of these ports still continues, but I cannot imagine that a Chinese shipping company would have sent a ship to Sevastopol without getting permission to do so from the Chinese authorities. So what we see is China deepening its economic links with Russia. I forgot to mention that amongst the other things that the Chinese are doing is that they're now allowing Russian companies to float bonds on the Chinese financial markets. Something which, again, up to now, the Chinese had been unwilling to do. So, ultimately, what all of this means is that the sanctions, as I've discussed, have utterly failed. And the Chinese are not only deepening their economic cooperation with Russia, but they're taking it to a completely different level. And they're not apparently bothered or worried about Western sanctions anymore. They feel that they have the Americans and the Europeans where they want them. They can switch off supplies of rare earths. They can create massive problems for Western supply chains. They believe that any sanctions imposed on them are not really going to endure for very long, and they're not going to let this get in the way of their economic cooperation with Russia. And this is going to have a bigger and bigger effect over the next few years. It means there's going to be a massive Chinese investment into the Russian economy, and that is going to inevitably going to mean that Russian economic growth rates are going to rise further still over and above what we have up to now been seeing. This is an underreported story in the West. The RAND Corporation has published another report criticizing the various Western plans for ending the conflict in Ukraine. It has spoken about the mistakes that were made with previous ceasefire proposals, that they were never detailed enough. It continues to insist on a ceasefire in the conflict in Ukraine, a freeze of the conflict in Ukraine, as being the only acceptable way forward, despite President Trump himself having accepted that the Russians will never agree to a ceasefire. But RAND continues to harp on the importance of a ceasefire. It talks about creating a detailed structure for a ceasefire. A fantastic idea, by the way. One that simply fails to take into account in any way the extraordinary logistical challenges. It accepts that the Russians are never going to agree, and fascinatingly, it accepts that sanctions have failed. So its solution: force the Russians to the peace table by increasing weapons supplies to Ukraine. It's extraordinary how some people still continue to cling on to ideas that have proved consistent failures. Sanctions have absolutely failed. The recent decisions that the Chinese have made in terms of Russian trade means that sanctions no longer have any meaning anymore, at least in terms of Russian domestic economic development. India, as I said, is going to follow, with Putin coming to India in December, in other words, in 2 months' time. And as for supplying more weapons to Ukraine, which weapons? Whose? Whose? The West has none to give. By now, that also ought to be obvious. Anyway, there we are. This is where I'm going to finish my program today. Every program, I seem to make the same point about the need for diplomatic engagement with the Russians. I wonder whether it will ever happen. I wonder how things will turn out in the absence of it. But there it is. Denialism, which is what we're getting in the West, both about the military situation in Ukraine, the build-up of the Russian military, the forging of the BRICS, the changes in the economic and geopolitical balance. Sooner or later, they're going to bring us all, in Europe especially, to earth, down to earth, with a bump. But until that happens, I suppose at the Duran, on these programs, we must continue to plough this lonely furrow and point out these hard truths. We're not, of course, the only ones who do this. But anyway, we will continue to do that. And until next time, this is where this program ends. So let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.